Welcome to Life Stories. Some betrayals cut deeper than words. Imagine standing at your father's funeral, grieving, only to have your husband whisper a chilling ultimatum. Move in with my parents or face divorce. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage. But what I uncovered next was far worse: secrets, lies, and a truth so dark it would change my life forever. This is the story of how I fought back, uncovered the deception, and reclaimed my future. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's story. The sound of dirt hitting my father's casket should have been the worst thing I heard that day. The dull, heavy thuds, each one marking the finality of his passing, should have broken me, but they didn't. That honor belonged to the words my husband, Ryan, whispered in my ear. Words that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and myself. Either we move in with my parents, or I'm filing for divorce. His grip on my elbow was too tight, his fingers pressing into my skin as if trying to force compliance. He didn't look at me, didn't soften his voice with grief or concern. Instead, his words were cold, final, a verdict rather than a request. I barely registered the dwindling crowd around us. The funeral had ended, and most guests had left, leaving behind only family and those who lingered out of obligation. My father's best friend, James, stood at a respectful distance, speaking quietly with a few others. But my focus was on Ryan and the pair of figures standing across the grave, his parents, Margaret and George. Margaret's sharp gaze bore into me like a vulture assessing its prey, while George hovered at her side, a quiet shadow as always. They had been circling me all afternoon, offering stiff condolences, their eyes watchful, waiting for the right moment to strike. I pulled against Ryan's grip, my voice low but firm. You're hurting me. He loosened his hold, but he didn't let go. This isn't a negotiation, Emily. Dad's retiring next month. They need us. I almost laughed, though nothing about this moment was funny. My father's body isn't even cold yet. Exactly, he said, his voice laced with practiced patience. You're emotional. You're not thinking clearly about what's best for everyone. Everyone, a word that meant something different when Ryan said it. He didn't mean me. He meant his parents. I stared at the freshly turned soil, fighting the urge to scream, or cry, or maybe both. What's best for everyone? I echoed bitterly. Or what's best for your mother? Ryan's jaw tightened. Don't start with that again. His tone carried the same warning it always did, the one that had made me back down too many times before. Mom and Dad have given us everything. The least we can do is help them transition into retirement. A weight settled in my chest, heavier than grief. Ryan wasn't just telling me what to do, he was reminding me of my place. My father had just been buried, and yet my future, my autonomy, was already being decided for me. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind us. And then James's warm, steady voice broke through the tension. Emily, dear, he said gently, his lined face full of concern. Your father would have wanted you to take some time, process things. Ryan's grip finally fell away, and I took a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. Margaret's voice sliced through the moment, smooth and commanding. We'll help her process, won't we, Ryan? I turned in time to see Ryan nod, just as he always did when his mother spoke. 15 years of marriage, and I had never once seen him refuse her anything. The weight of the estate papers in my purse felt heavier now. Ryan didn't know about them yet. Didn't know the choices my father had already made. Choices that would change everything. I need to go, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have things to arrange at the house. Our house, Ryan corrected. And it's too big for one person. Mom and Dad's place makes more sense. I swallowed the retort rising in my throat. Not here, not now. James touched my shoulder. I'll drive you. She's fine, Ryan snapped. I'll take my wife home. I squared my shoulders. Actually, I'm not fine, and I'm not going anywhere with you right now. A sharp gasp from Margaret, perfectly timed for dramatic effect. Ryan, darling, you see how she's acting? This is exactly why she needs us. Ryan's expression darkened, the edges of his control fraying. Emily, don't make a scene. But I was already walking away. James falling into step beside me. Behind us, Margaret's voice rose in carefully measured distress. And I could practically see Ryan's face reddening with the embarrassment she so effortlessly wielded. You can't just walk away from family, she called after me. But I could. And for the first time in years, I realized that I should. The truth hit me halfway to James's car. I had been walking away from myself for 15 years, one small step at a time. Letting Ryan's family reshape me into their idea of a proper wife. Watching my own dreams fade like old photographs. Buried under obligations that were never truly mine. Not anymore. James opened the car door. And I slid inside, my hands shaking as I buckled the seatbelt. Through the windshield, I could see Ryan and his parents huddled together. 3 heads bent in conversation. No doubt planning their next move. Let them plan. They didn't know about the recordings yet. Or the letters. Or the truth about what my father had discovered before he died. They had no idea what was coming. The drive back to my father's estate was quiet. James didn't push me to talk. And I was grateful for that. My mind was too tangled. Caught somewhere between grief and anger. Loss and something dangerously close to relief. When we pulled up to the house, my house now, it felt different. Heavier somehow. The old Victorian loomed in the fading afternoon light. Its shadows stretching across the lawn. This had always been a place of warmth. A refuge. But tonight, it felt like the battlefield it was about to become. Ryan's Mercedes was already in the driveway. Of course. He had beaten me here. James put the car in park and turned toward me. You don't have to go in alone. Emily. I shook my head, gripping the strap of my purse. Actually, I do. But thank you. For everything. I stepped out before he could argue. Feeling the weight of the estate papers against my hip. Ryan had no idea what was inside. The front door swung open before I reached it. Ryan stood there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up like he was preparing for battle. Behind him, I could hear Margaret's voice floating from the kitchen. Sharp and precise. Directing someone, probably George, to move something. Change something. Already making herself at home. Nice of you to finally join us. Ryan said, stepping aside. Mom's making dinner. In my kitchen. I corrected. Our kitchen. Emily. And she's trying to help. Help. That word again. Margaret's version of help never felt like help at all. I moved past him, my hands balling into fists as the scent of her signature pot roast hit me like a slap. She had cooked the same meal for every major event in our married life. Birthdays. Anniversaries. The day Ryan made partner at his firm. And now, here it was again. On the day I buried my father. There you are. Margaret's voice carried that artificial brightness she reserved for public performances. She stood at my counter, wearing an apron I had never seen before, one she had probably brought from her own house. George barely looked up from his phone. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I'm not hungry. Ryan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Mom went to all this trouble. Let her go, darling. Margaret cut in, her knife clicking against the cutting board. She's grieving, though I do wish she'd consider how her behavior affects others. My behavior. I turned on my heel, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard Margaret's stage whisper. You see what I mean, Ryan? This is exactly why she needs us here. I didn't stop until I reached my father's study. I needed to breathe, to think, too. But something was wrong. The door was ajar, and as I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. The room had been ransacked. Drawers hung open, papers were scattered across the desk. And the painting behind his chair, the one he had always joked contained his secrets, hung crooked on the wall. My hands shook as I straightened it, revealing the safe behind, still locked. Thank God. A voice behind me made me jump. Looking for something specific? I spun around. Ryan stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. What did you do? I demanded. Me? He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I was looking for the will. Since you ran off with James instead of discussing things like an adult. The will is with the lawyers. You know that, do I? He took a step closer. And I caught the scent of scotch on his breath. You've been awfully secretive lately. Just like your father was at the end. A chill ran through me. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Ryan said, his voice dropping lower, That I know he changed his will 3 weeks ago. Right after our last dinner together. Right after Mom and I told him about our plans for this property. The pieces clicked into place. The tension at that dinner. My father's sudden insistence on updating his estate planning. The way Ryan and Margaret had been hovering ever since. Watching Dad like hawks. You were planning this before he even died. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing. Planning what? He said. To take care of family? To make something of this oversized monument to your father's ego? My father's legacy. You think this house is just some symbol? My voice wavered, but the fire inside me burned hotter. He built this place for his family. For me. Ryan's expression twisted. Your father was sick, Emily. He wasn't thinking clearly. A creak on the stairs. Margaret's voice, floating up from below. Everything all right up there? Ryan didn't take his eyes off me. Fine, Mom. He called back. Emily's just having a moment. I swallowed hard. We're not done here. Ryan smirked, stepping closer. Actually, he said, I think we are. But he was wrong. Because the estate wasn't the only thing my father had left behind. And Ryan had no idea what was coming. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the study, my father's sanctuary, ransacked. Violated. I kept hearing Ryan's voice. Thick with scotch and arrogance. Telling me my father had been sick. That he hadn't been thinking clearly. But my father had been thinking clearly enough to change his will. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my untouched coffee growing cold as I went through the documents James had given me. They weren't just blueprints, they were plans. Plans for the estate, drawn up months before my father even got sick. My hands trembled as I traced the inked lines of sleek modern buildings. Sprawling across the land, erasing my father's gardens, his greenhouse, his history, the date in the corner, 3 months ago. Ryan had these drawn up before Dad even fell ill. My stomach turned. A rustle of movement made me look up. George stood in the doorway, watching me. There was something different about him this morning. His usual silence felt heavier. More deliberate. You found them, he said quietly, nodding to the blueprints. You knew? I demanded, my voice raw. He sighed and stepped inside, lowering himself into the chair across from me. Margaret said it was for the best. That we'd all be together. Like a real family should be. A bitter laugh escaped me. By destroying my father's home? George rubbed a hand over his face. Looking older than I had ever seen him. Your father, he exhaled shakily. Do you know what Margaret called him? The obstacle. Every night, planning and plotting while I sat there. Watching my wife and son turn into people I didn't recognize. I stared at him. My pulse hammering. You knew, I whispered, the whole time. You knew what they were planning. George's shoulders slumped. I told myself I was imagining things. That they couldn't, do something like that. But 3 days before he died, I found the pills in Margaret's purse. My heart stopped. Pills. The ones my father had been taking. The ones that had made him weak. Confused. What were they? My voice barely sounded like my own. George swallowed hard. Sleeping medication, but in doses far higher than what anyone should take. I gripped the edge of the table. My vision swimming. Margaret had been drugging him. She had been killing him. The next few hours were a blur. James arrived, bringing more documents. Emails between Ryan and various developers. All dated weeks before my father's death. The language was careful, coded, but the intent was clear. They had been waiting for him to sign over power of attorney. But he hadn't. The paper trembled in my hands. It was there, at the bottom of the unsigned document, his name. Left blank. A small victory from beyond the grave. A knock on the door made me jump. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I ignored it, but James peered through the window and stiffened. It's Ryan, he muttered. My stomach twisted as I stood, forcing my expression into something unreadable. I opened the door, and Ryan stepped inside, his face tight with barely contained anger. You left last night, he said. Wouldn't answer your phone. I crossed my arms. I didn't think I owed you an explanation. His jaw clenched. You do when you're my wife. I almost laughed. Do I? Or do I just have to do what your mother tells me? Ryan flinched, but he recovered quickly. Mom's lawyers are ready. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You mean harder for you? I shot back. Because it's already plenty hard for me. Like, say, finding out that my father was being drugged while you and your mother waited for him to sign his life away. Ryan paled. That's ridiculous. Is it? I threw the papers onto the table. Because I have documents, emails, blueprints, proof that you were planning this before he even got sick. And guess what? The police are very interested in Martha's prescriptions. He looked down at the documents. His Adam's apple bobbing. You don't understand, he said finally, his voice low. Mom was just what? I snapped. Taking care of things? Taking care of me? Like she's done my entire marriage? Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You're making a mistake, Emily. No, I said, stepping closer. I made my mistake 15 years ago when I married into this family. His face darkened. You really want to do this? Fight me over a house and some land? He gestured around. Because I promise you, Emily, you won't win. I thought of the recordings in my purse. The letters. The truth about what my father had discovered before he died. We'll see about that, I said, pushing past him toward the door. Behind me, Ryan's voice was tight with rage. Mom's lawyers will eat you alive. You don't have the stomach for this fight. I turned back, my pulse steady. Maybe not before, I said, but you made sure I do now. Margaret was at the estate, meeting with contractors in an hour. She thought she was winning. She wasn't, because in exactly 45 minutes, I was going to show her what losing really looked like. Margaret stood in the middle of the estate's garden, surrounded by a group of contractors. She was poised, perfectly composed, her manicured hand resting on the architectural plans spread across a portable table. The sun reflected off her pearl earrings as she gestured toward a section of the estate. No doubt detailing her grand vision for the future, a future she had planned without me. Ryan stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but when he saw me walking toward them, flanked by James and George, his entire posture stiffened. Margaret's smile faltered for only a second before she recovered. Emily, she greeted smoothly, as if she were hosting a garden party rather than dismantling my father's legacy. I was wondering when you'd finally join us. I ignored her and addressed the contractors instead. Who's in charge here? A man in his early 50s with graying hair glanced between me and Ryan before stepping forward. That would be me, Frank Dawson. And you are? I pulled the estate documents from my purse and handed them to him. Emily Walker, the owner of this property. Margaret's hand twitched at her side, but her smile didn't waver. Emily, darling, we've already discussed this. The estate is far too large for one person. Ryan and I have worked tirelessly to ensure a smooth transition. Transition into what? I snapped, turning to Frank. Because from what I see, this is an attempt to erase everything my father built. Frank scanned the papers, his brows furrowing. He flipped through a few pages before looking up. Mrs. Walker. It's Miss Walker, I corrected. At least, it will be soon enough. Ryan exhaled sharply, but I didn't acknowledge him. Frank hesitated, then continued. Miss Walker, I wasn't aware that this development was contested. Oh, it's more than contested, I said, pulling out another set of documents. These are emails between my husband and multiple developers, all dated weeks before my father passed away. They show that he and his mother were planning this before my father was even sick. Frank's frown deepened as he read through the pages. This is, he exhaled slowly, I don't like being lied to. Mr. Davidson. Ryan's jaw tensed. Emily is emotional. She's grieving. She doesn't know what she's saying. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, I know exactly what I'm saying. And I also know that Margaret was drugging my father. A ripple of murmurs spread through the contractors. Frank looked at me, then at Margaret. That's a serious accusation. Margaret's carefully composed mask cracked for just a second before she straightened, shaking her head with mock sympathy. Emily, I know this is a difficult time, but this kind of slander is unacceptable. Slander? I pulled another sheet from my bag. These are pharmacy records showing your prescriptions for high-dosage sleeping medication. Medication that matches exactly with the substances found in my father's system before he died. The air in the garden turned suffocatingly still. Ryan's face paled. You don't have any real proof. I reached into my bag one last time. Actually, I do. The small USB drive glinted in the sunlight as I held it up. You see, my father was a very intelligent man. I continued, my voice calm but sharp. He knew something wasn't right. So he started recording. Margaret's pearl earrings caught the light as she stiffened. What are you talking about? I stepped forward, lowering my voice so only she and Ryan could hear. The cameras were everywhere. I said, in his study, in the greenhouse, even in the teacups you insisted he drink from every evening. Margaret's breath caught. Ryan took a step toward me, his voice low with fury. You're bluffing. I smirked. Am I? From behind me, James pulled out his phone. The police are already reviewing the footage, he said, looking directly at Margaret, and they're very interested in having a conversation with you. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across her face. Frank cleared his throat and turned to his team. Pack it up. We're done here. One by one, the contractors began rolling up their blueprints, collecting their supplies. The sound of their quiet muttering, their sideways glances at Margaret, filled the space between us. You can't do this, Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. You can't just walk away from family. But I already had. You thought you were winning, I said, slipping the USB drive back into my purse. You didn't realize you were already losing. Sirens echoed in the distance. Margaret's face turned ashen. Ryan's mouth opened, then closed. George, silent until now, finally spoke. They're here for you, Margaret, he said softly. Not even you can talk your way out of this. I turned and started walking toward the house. The sound of police cars pulling into the driveway behind me. Margaret's reign was over, and I had just taken my first breath of freedom. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Margaret sat motionless, her face eerily still, but I saw the slight tremor in her hands as the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. Ryan sat beside her, his usual arrogance stripped away, replaced by something hollow, something lost. George testified against them both. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a man finally breaking free from years of silent complicity. His courage helped seal their fate. The estate was mine, untouched, preserved as my father had intended. But it wasn't just about property anymore. It was about justice, about truth. Back at the estate, I found James in the greenhouse, tending to the surviving orchids. Among them, a single white bloom stood taller than the rest, Willow's Justice. The flower my father had spent years cultivating in secret. His final gift to me. His last letter echoed in my mind. Truth, like orchids, requires patience, careful tending, and the courage to bloom at the right moment. I traced my fingers along the petals, letting the weight of the past finally lift from my shoulders. Margaret had always believed she controlled my life. Ryan had thought I was too weak to fight back. But they were wrong. I had found my voice. I had taken back my future. And this time, no one would take it from me. Subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible real-life dramas.